A biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. Penna, Dexter across the table from me. I want to thank Debbie Georgiadis for covering the program yesterday when I was out doing some things at Dallas Baptist University. And we're going to spend some time looking at this budget, and I put that in quotes because really nothing more than 2,200 pages of legislative text that were dropped on everybody's desk just before they had to vote for it. And if you want to call it a budget, okay, but it's really just an omnibus spending bill for the rest of this fiscal year. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Penna Dexter's commentary on the oral arguments this week before the Supreme Court having to do with pregnancy centers and many other topics on the agenda. But Penna, one of the things that we learned in class when we were kids is that you have budgets that start in the House and they go through various committees. And again, if you've studied it for a while, you know there's 12 different budgets, and then that goes to the Senate, and then they once again vote on it, and then they get together in a conference committee to resolve it, and eventually that's passed and then sent to the president, and that's all done before that particular fiscal year takes place. None of that happened in this particular case.
Yeah, tonight is the deadline, or there's a quote-unquote government shutdown, and it was passed, and now it has to go to President Trump's desk. We've seen that he's actually threatened to veto the bill, and, you know, it is the largest spending bill in U.S. history, and this is under Republican Congress with a Republican president. So, you know, I don't blame Donald Trump for threatening to veto it. I mean, it will cause, you know, politically problems either way. He's really in between a rock and a hard place. And a lot of people are saying, as you listen to different commentators, that this was almost an establishment Republican and / Democrat attempt, again, to undermine Donald Trump because most of his priorities aren't in there. Right. There are increases because of the they broke the caps of the sequester in the last vote. They have increased defense budget, military pay, and some things like that. But the wall, there is some wall funding, but it's way less than was asked for. And the new types of walls, the concrete wall, and those things are prohibited in this. There's not increased money for enforcement. So some of the things that President Trump ran on, he has slashed several agencies since he's been president, just by a stroke of the pen. He's trying to get rid of the regulatory state, or a lot of it. But there's money for a lot of these obscure agencies. There are increases, big increases for them. I mean, what about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting that, you know, so many conservatives want to get rid of? It's still there, funded for 2 more years. Other agencies that you've never heard of are still in there. So, you know, it's just, it doesn't fund the president's priorities. And yet it's done so fast, and we're running out of time that you're almost stuck signing it. And we'll just see what he does. It's going to be an interesting topic for the show today, and I think something I'd like to hear from our listeners on.
I would, too. As a matter of fact, all you really need to know is it still continues to fund Planned Parenthood and does not fund the wall. So you can see some of that. $4.6 billion for states to combat the opioid crisis and additional funds for election security and infrastructure spending and those kinds of things. But again, if you'd like to join us at any point, do you think the president should veto this $1.3 trillion spending bill? Or should he simply sign it and try later on? Now, by the way, of try later on, there is something else that I've just heard, and I had not found that in the article we've posted here, but I have heard this from more than one source, so I know it must be true, that the way it is constructed in the Senate portion is that the Senate won't have a budget next year. Now, think that through, Penna, because we've talked about what you're supposed to have as a budget. Well, then, if you don't have a budget, you can't put anything new in it, and that would be, for example, things like the wall. So if indeed during these off-year elections, the Republicans are going to come back to their constituency and say, look what great job we did, I don't think there are going to be as many people pleased with that, because they said you have the House, you have the Senate, you have a Republican in the Oval Office, and a $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill. Is that the best you can do?
Wow, I didn't know that either. And that really makes this a very important piece of legislation, probably one of the last times that the Republicans could have made a stand before the 2018 elections. So in a sense, they may be sealing their fate right now.
Yes, well, I'm just thinking about that because this may be the last, at least bipartisan one. They may try some other things, but does anybody seriously think repeal and replace of Obamacare is going to go anywhere? Anything on maybe making the tax cuts permanent, that's not going to go anywhere. DACA is not in here. Does anybody think that's going to go anywhere? So, I mean, you can begin to realize this may be the last opportunity for Republicans, many of whom right now, and I want to cover that maybe next week. We might need to get Paul Rasmussen in here, for example, and some of the others to talk about that. There are a lot of vulnerable Republican districts in the House, and you only need, 23 to flip it over so that Nancy Pelosi or whoever replaces Nancy Pelosi becomes the Democratic leader in the House. And if the best that you can say to individuals that might or might not vote for you is, we came up with 2,200 pages dropped less than 24 hours before people had to vote on a $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill. That is amazing. And again, those numbers are hard to get your handle on, but think of this. When Ronald Reagan left office, the national debt was about $1.3 trillion. So that means from President George Washington to the end of President Ronald Reagan's administration, the accumulated debt was $1.3 trillion. This bill actually spends that much in actually less than a year, because remember that the fiscal year starts from the end of September to now. So we're only we're not quite halfway into this fiscal year. And we're talking about spending as much in 1 year as with the accumulated debt from George Washington to Ronald Reagan.
So it takes our debt over $20 trillion.
Sure. Yes. Well, that's the other real big issue there as well. So that's one of the issues we'll put on the table. But when we come back, I want to also, of course, later on get back to the issue of the budget and the debt and the spending bill. But Penna Dexter has written a very good piece about the oral arguments this week before the Supreme Court about California. Matter of fact, we even posted one of these articles on the Supreme Court confronts California craziness. So we got a couple of different pieces that you can find. You can find her commentary, another piece that came out by Josh Shepard. But these are some important issues as well, because it really just says how far can a government go to compel speech? And Penn, as we well know, we've talked about this with Kelly Shackelford, who will join us a little bit later this hour and will be with us throughout the program, in terms of what would happen if a baker were forced to actually bake a cake for an individual that they disagreed with on religious grounds. This is even broader than religious liberty. This is just free speech. Can I compel a pregnancy center to publicize and promote abortion? And it just is hard to even imagine that the bill passed both the California Assembly, the California Senate, was signed by the governor, and then it was even ratified by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. But I got a sense from the oral arguments, I want to get your comments when we come back from the break, that even some of the Supreme Court justices that may have considered themselves to be pro-choice or pro-abortion had a little bit of problem with what the government of the state of California did. So we'll come back and talk about that. Penna Dexter's commentary is there, one of those articles about California craziness. We got a lot to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Yosef warns us that we face both external threats and internal threats in his new book, The Hidden Enemy. We face an external threat from radical political Islam. That does not mean that all Muslims are an enemy. He has great concern and passion for Muslims, having been born in Egypt. His broadcasts go into the Muslim countries to proclaim the gospel, but he is well aware that radical Muslims want to sweep away Western civilization and impose a global caliphate. The internal threat we face is from a coalition of secular humanists, atheists, and leftists. They want to erase America's Judeo-Christian values and replace them with relativism, sexual liberation, and hedonism. He calls this the Great American Delusion. Humanists and atheists have been successful in transforming much of America through the media, the courts, the educational system, and popular culture. He also recognizes that these two groups could not be more opposed to each other in theory, but there is a surprising alliance that sometimes has developed between Muslims and humanists. His book provides some interesting details and examples of how this has happened in the past. Now, near the end of the book, he also talks about another enemy inside the church. He reminds us that some believers in the past opened the door to the false religion of Muhammad. He sees a similar accommodation today where church leaders in certain denominations are preaching a false gospel. It is another warning that we should stay true to the gospel and reject those who want to try to make the Bible relevant to society by making the church and the Bible conform to society. This book will help you understand the threats we face and encourage you to take a bold stand for the gospel. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Affirm Films, Paul, Apostle of Christ, starring Jim Caviezel, rated PG-13, now playing. Information at paulmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Weekend edition, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. One of the issues we put on the table is whether or not the president should veto this omnibus spending bill. And again, if you think that he should veto that and send a signal to go back and try again, or whether you just say, no, we don't need a government shutdown right now, let's just move ahead. I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Second issue on the table, Penna Dexter has posted her commentary, and it has to do, Penna, with compelled speech and these pregnancy centers in the state of California. Tell us more, if you mind.
Well, the case was heard at the U.S. Supreme Court on Tuesday, and really there are pro-life facts in the case, there are religious liberty facts in the case, but the case is really comes down to, and what is being considered in this case is free speech, compelled speech. And the case is, it's out of California. It challenges a California law, NIFLA, which is, NIFLA stands for, a National Institute of Family and Life Advocates. They're kind of a group that oversees or supports crisis pregnancy centers, one of the most effective pro-life ministries we've got in the country. This is NIFLA versus Becerra. Becerra is the Attorney General of California. So California has this law. It's called the Reproductive Fact Act. And this law says that pregnancy centers, the kind that are medically licensed, have to basically post something in their center that says, you can get a free or low-cost abortion. Here's how to get it. So you're there trying to help women save their babies, but you have to tell them how to get an abortion. That's basically what this law is telling pregnancy centers. Some pregnancy centers are not medical. They don't have sonogram machines. They don't have doctors. They support people with diapers, with encouragement, with spiritual help, talking to them about, just the life issues and things like that. And sometimes they'll, provide lots of financial help and things like that. So those groups, they are forced to post signs, even if they say abortion kills a baby or whatever. They've got to put all kinds of disclaimers on poster-sized signs in the same type font as their pro-life message in 13 languages.
13 languages.
And all of if these are such draconian laws, and they all have to be done, and if they're not done, huge fines on these pregnancy centers, which would put most of them out of the ministry, and they would no longer exist. So the plaintiff is NIFLA, this group. It's run by Tom Glessner. He's an attorney, and they help pregnancy centers. The group that is actually arguing the case is Alliance Defending Freedom. Mike Ferris has actually argued the case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And it really comes down to, does the abortion or the pregnancy center have to say things that they don't believe?
Right.
They have to send a message, communicate a message to these women in crisis that they exist to counter. George Will wrote a great column about it, and he talked about the right to remain silent. Mm-hmm. And really, these centers should not have to say anything about abortion or how someone can get an abortion. Instead, they should have the freedom to be able to bring the message to support these women who are in this time in their life when they've got to make a terrible decision, a hard decision. And so we've had these kinds of cases in states across the nation, including in the state of Texas, where these kinds of laws were requirements in cities in Texas were struck down, in Maryland and other places. But California, they seem, first of all, it's a crazy law. Second of all, it's gone all the way to the Ninth Circuit and been affirmed. And so now it's at the Supreme Court. And I think it would be great to get a good decision that's overwhelmingly striking this down. And it's kind of, if you look at the article that we've posted, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought it was a little bit much to require this of these pregnancy centers. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. We have to wait till June for the decision. But I think in a sense, this would be a great message to send across the nation for speech, free speech, against compelled speech, and just, supporting a ministry across the nation that does great good for people at a very low cost.
Well, again, one of the things that I thought was so striking is how far this went. As you pointed out, again, 13 different languages. And again, just read the piece you just referenced there. After Michael Ferris, the lawyer for the centers, has said advertisements, including billboards, would have to offer the information in large part in 13 languages. That's when you have Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, Justice Ginsburg used to be a lawyer for the ACLU. So if there's anybody that's going to go, oh, I think this is okay, she turned to the lawyer for California and said, if you have to say those two sentences in 13 different languages, it can be very burdensome. You think?
You think.
The word that was the word of the day, and we've had a couple of people, John Stonestreet in his Breakpoint commentary said, the word of the day was burdensome. How many times did the word burdensome come up? You know, if they hadn't required it in 13 different languages, if they'd only required some note, they might have gotten away with this, but because there is maybe no sense of common sense right now when you have essentially California, a one-party state, Democratic state, that both in the Assembly and in the Senate and even in the governor, nobody looked at this and go, this probably is a little bit too much. If we really want this to pass constitutional muster, maybe we need to ratchet back. But nobody said that. And then, of course, I love George Will's column. The Ninth Circuit Court, whose reasoning is frequently novel and whose rulings are frequently reversed, actually had no problem with that. Well, I got a feeling pretty much from the oral arguments that the Supreme Court will have a problem with it.
I think they will. I hope that you'll go to pointofview.net and look at this article, because there are pictures in there, and they give the idea of what a poster would actually look like, or how much you actually have to post in how many languages and how absurd it is. Somebody else who spoke on it during oral arguments was Anthony Kennedy. And, he sounds like he would think this was a crazy idea. And if he would, and then you've got even Ginsburg.
Yes.
May call this burdensome. I think we could have a good decision here.
You mentioned George Will, too. I love his line. He does something that you and I do so often, and that is he turns it around. He said, suppose a pro-life state, let's think Mississippi, Alabama, something like that, were to require all publicly and privately funded abortion providers to advertise on their premises the locations and services of crisis pregnancy centers. Well, you know the howl that you'd hear from the pro-lifers. Or let's go back to your column, because you've got some other suggestions he had about when the baby's brain forms and some things like that. Don't you have some of that from his column? Yeah.
If you, he mentioned that if you had to post the truth about fetal development, in fact, if you had to say the baby's brain begins to form at 18 days after conception, by week 9, the baby can suck his or her thumb. During weeks 10 to 13, bones harden, and fingerprints and actually fingernails. Remember Juno, the movie, when they talked about fingernails, she changed her mind about an abortion. But if you had to just post the truth about fetal development there, how about that? I mean, would that stand up to scrutiny here? So, it's good to kind of make those types of suggestions. And would this be a free speech violation?
Yes. Well, and again, I think most people would say, well, you could not compel abortion clinics to advertise for pregnancy resource centers. Well, then why are you asking pregnancy resource centers to advertise for abortion? Other than the fact that, of course, they can say, well, it's legal. Yeah, but so is what the pregnancy resource center is legal. So we'll see where this goes. But I hope that some of these compelled speech cases go the other direction. We'll be waiting, of course, for the case out of Colorado. That's Jack Phillips. And that's also an ADF case, isn't it? Smitty's and Lions Defending Freedom have taken a couple of those cases. In just a minute, Kelly Shackelford will be with us. He's, of course, with First Liberty. And they have, of course, the case out of Oregon. So each one of these cases not only has an impact for those individuals in the case of pregnancy centers in California or Jack Phillips in Colorado, but it has an impact for all sorts of other individuals as well, don't they?
Yeah, and that's why we pay so much attention to these cases here on Point of View. And we will be watching this, although now the Supreme Court is getting down to the end and almost done with the arguments, and we're going to have to wait till June to see really what the decisions are.
Well, again, if I've got this right, and maybe Kelly can correct me if I'm wrong, we've got the compelled speech on the issue of the baker. We have sort of the compelled participation in terms of the unions, which is sort of like speech. And then we have this one, compelled speech, in terms of the pregnancy resource centers. So I cannot remember a time in which we had so many cases all sort of around this issue of free speech, religious freedom, and compelled speech.
Yeah, does the government get to tell us how to think and what to say? That's the big question.
If all those three come down the right way, which I hope that they do, that will be a real win for free speech and for religious liberty. If they come back all the other direction, we're in a very different kind of world. I fear what will happen is, in some cases, the Supreme Court decides not to decide. They kick it back down, and we will see. But we'll see how that plays out. Anyway, we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll spend some time getting into a couple of other issues. But we've put a couple of issues on the table. Should the president veto the spending bill? Should the Supreme Court stand up for free speech? Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page. We'll be back right after this.
From Affirm Films, the studio that brought you Risen and War Room, comes Paul, Apostle of Christ. Two men challenged an empire in order to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ and spread their message to the world.
Where sin abounds, grace abounds more.
Starring Jim Caviezel. Paul, Apostle of Christ. Rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. Now playing. More information is available at paulmovie.com.
Few of us get the chance to really make a difference, but today you have an opportunity. The question is whether you will seize it. Becoming a Truth Team partner with Point of View magnifies your impact in this generation and perhaps for many to come. When you stop what you're doing and call us or give online, you invest in hard work that has changed lives and communities for 45 years. Grab this opportunity. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Don't let this opportunity pass by. Join the team and make a difference. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talked about the omnibus spending bill. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later this hour, if not in the next hour, because I love this piece here. Did the Democrats spike the ball over the omnibus spending bill too early? Because there might be a veto coming from Donald Trump. But in addition to Penna Dexter, we also have Kelly Shackelford in studio with us as well. And Kelly, we talked about the commentary that Penna put together on the oral arguments this week before the Supreme Court having to do with the pregnancy centers. And this is more than just religious issues. This is really free speech issues. Obviously, a lot of these pregnancy centers are run by people that are religious, but that's not the point. When you compel speech and tell a pregnancy center that they have to post in large font in 13 different languages that abortion is available at a pregnancy center, that just seems at its face unconstitutional.
Yeah, the brief we filed on behalf of scholars across the country pointed out that that this is the worst type of violation of free speech. The way speech works is, the government could try to cut off your ability to say something. If they do it because of the content of what you say, that's bad. Okay, and I think people go, oh, wow, okay. If they just said, we don't want you to speak, okay, that's not good, right? But if they say, we don't like what you're saying, that's bad. If they say, you can talk about this subject, but only from the government's viewpoint, that's the worst. Yeah. That's what they did here. They basically said, we're going to tell you that you're going to refer out for abortions, even though you have the opposite opinion. And Gorsuch's question during the oral argument, I thought, was the great question, which is, if the state wants to give this message, there's nothing stopping them from giving this message. But there's no reason to say that they have to commandeer private citizens, essentially, to have them give the government's message. And that's where I think they're in serious trouble. And you're in trouble when even Kagan and
Ruth Bader Ginsburg,
yes, are questioning and saying, this is really bad. Yeah, this looks like gerrymandering. So that's not a good sign. And so some of the comments after the argument were that this could be 7-2, it could be 9-0. We'll have to wait and see. But I do think it's not going to go so well for those who think that the way to get their point across is to have the government force other people to express things that they don't agree with. I mean, I wish we lived in a country where people understood that's a bad idea, no matter what side of the issue you're on. But man, in the the pro-abortion community, I mean, they don't care. They just want to use government power for their ends, and they don't seem to care, what is, destroyed in the process. Very short-sighted, because that very free speech and all that would be used against them to destroy their ability to express their views as well, but they don't seem to care about that.
We've talked about how, just if you took the other side and they were forced at an abortion clinic to post a sign about fetal development, for instance, and George Will brought that up, where, you would say, when does the heart start beating and when does the brain start forming? When do you have fingernails? If they were just forced to put that up, nothing else, just something about fetal development, they would scream and they would sue and they would not do it.
And there would actually be a reason for that, because, one of the things that we have in the medical community is what's called informed consent, that people really do need to know what the decision that they're making with regard to their body and what all is implied in that. They should be told a lot of things they're not being told. But in this case, this isn't about, sort of a health deal or informed consent. This is about, hey, we the government have this particular program, and we're going to create this law where this law only applies if you have certain beliefs. We're going to aim specifically for these pregnancy care centers. And when you look at who the law applies to, you realize, hey, wow, nobody else has to follow this law except for the pregnancy care centers. That's disturbing in and of itself. But then the message you're forcing them to give is something that they disagree with. And again, as Gorsuch's question, I think, brought out, why do they have to carry your message?
Yeah.
Why can't you carry your own message? I mean, you're the government of California, for heaven's sakes. You think you could get the message out? And so it's just the ultimate intolerance to me of the government coming in and thinking it can take over private citizens, force them to express things that violate their conscience, and there's really just no justification for it.
One of the articles we've posted here is the Supreme Court confronts California craziness. And Kelly, think about this for just a minute, having two of us having grown up in California. This bill had to start in the California Assembly and passed. It then went to the California Senate and passed. Then it was signed by the governor, and, of course, he signed it. And then even the Ninth Circuit Court, which I guess is not surprising, as George Will said, a court whose reasoning is frequently novel and rulings are frequently reversed,
yes,
went along with this as well. And yet all through this, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg used the word of the day, it was burdensome. And nowhere along the line did it ever occur to anybody to say, this might just be a little bit too much, that it has to be in large font in 13 different languages. Nobody said, maybe if we really want to try to single out pregnancy centers, we shouldn't be so blatant. But that was the problem. And I think this is why it could end up being 9-0 or 7-2 and not even close.
Well, not to get too much in the weeds, but to show you, what, I mean, it's almost like a blessing sometimes when you have these states that are so out of touch, like California, because they don't even hide what they're doing. And so what they did is the author of, the bill actually publicly stated that they were doing this because they were aiming at, pregnancy care centers. They basically openly admitted they were engaging in viewpoint discrimination. Right. What did the Ninth Circuit say? They said, well, even if you say that's what you meant to do, it's really a matter of what the law does, and we don't think the law really does that. And so here they were. It's like somebody saying, you're fired because you're black. And then the court says, well, we know they said that, but we just don't think that that's really the reason. We're looking at some other reasons here. And so, no, that's why they did this. They did this because they were engaging in viewpoint discrimination, which violates the First Amendment. The Ninth Circuit still tried to, wipe that away. And they also created a whole new class of free speech regulation. Again, not to get too technical with everybody, but there used to be a way you treat speech and then commercial speech operated by these cases. And they had to create a whole separate category here because, for instance, a lot of these pregnancy care centers, they're not engaging in commercial speech. They're not taking money. Mm-hmm. So, so you can see it in their brain right there. Oh, my gosh. Well, how do we restrict their free speech if, under commercial speech, if they're not really engaging in commercial speech? Well, let's just create a new thing. We'll call it professional speech. That's what they called it. If you're engaging in something that connects to a profession, now we can regulate that too. And so they just went through all these shenanigans to try to get to an end of basically just being anti-pro-life. Mm-hmm. And the court saw that, and it was even, I think, a little embarrassing to the liberals on the court.
If you want to see Penna Dexter's commentary, that is up there. And, of course, we always make the commentaries available Monday through Friday, mine, and then hers comes out on Saturday. This other piece from the stream, the Supreme Court confronts California craziness. And, of course, we also have a link to Kelly Shackelford and First Liberty so they can see that as well. And just before we take a break, we were talking about, just before you had a chance to join us, you've got one case about compelled speech, which relates to Jack Phillips out of Colorado. You have another one that's sort of compelled speech because it has to do with what might be compulsory unionism and those kinds of things. And then you have this case, which involves the pregnancy centers and compelled speech. I cannot remember a time, but you're kind of a historian. I can never remember a time when we had so many cases resolving this issue of compelled speech right here before the Supreme Court in this session.
No, it's very unusual because we've kind of gotten to a point in our country where we really are, we're really getting somewhat dangerously close to a cliff here. And we've seen it with kind of what's happening on college campuses, shut down the free speech of the speaker, the riots, the shouting down and all this. Our culture didn't used to permit that. I mean, everybody would say, even if they disagreed, they would say, let them speak, because we believed in the marketplace of ideas. That's now under attack, and it's under attack in the courts, in addition to in the culture, and we're in that battle. And I think religious freedom's at the very center of this, right? I mean, if you lose that first freedom, you tend to lose all the freedoms. And so as we've seen this escalating attacks on religious freedom, it's not surprising that free speech is right behind it. And this is a twofold, sort of two-pronged battle that we're in for the next, I don't know, maybe 5 years, 10 years. And we're going to decide whether we keep these things or whether we lose them. And things like this, I mean, this is the extreme. We should be able to win, and hopefully that'll start really a movement back to make sure that we do protect religious freedom and free speech in these type of situations.
As we've said so many times before, be in prayer about many of these cases. We will come back and we might even talk about some of the other cases that First Liberty's involved with, but if all three of these go the right way, we're in a much better situation. If all three of these go the wrong way, or they split 2 and 1 or 1 and 2, who knows what kind of world we're in. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
The U.S. Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments in a case that will determine whether pro-life pregnancy centers will be forced to speak a message that promotes the very evil they exist to combat. Nifla v. Becerra challenges the Reproductive Fact Act. This 2015 California law orders licensed crisis pregnancy centers to instruct women on how to obtain free or low-cost abortions through the state's Medi-Cal program. The Fact Act levies draconian fines on centers that don't comply. The law also forces non-medical pregnancy centers that provide resources such as pregnancy test kits, baby clothes, and diapers to post large and prominent disclosures stating they are not medical, chipping away at the confidence of an already scared pregnant client. The plaintiff in the case is the National Institute of Family and Life Advocates. NIFLA provides legal counsel and training to pregnancy centers nationwide. In a brief supporting the pregnancy centers, Cato Institute's Ilya Shapiro points out that California does not require abortion providers to post ads for adoption agencies or other alternatives to abortion. The real issue here is compelled speech. The Washington Post's George Will asks in a column, suppose a pro-life state government were to require all publicly and privately funded abortion providers to advertise on their premises the locations and services of crisis pregnancy centers. Or what if they were required to post on their premises, websites, and advertisements accurate information about fetal development? What if they had to say that the unborn baby's brain begins to form about 18 days after conception, and that by week 9 the baby can suck his or her thumb, and that during weeks 10 to 13 bones harden, and fingerprints and fingernails begin to form? This would be a free speech violation. NIFLA's founder and president, Thomas Glessner, says the FACT law mandates under the law that the pro-life centers are advertising for abortion. The Supreme Court should strike it down. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I just mentioned, too, that we also, of course, broadcast on Facebook Live, and many of you have, from time to time, left questions or comments there, and I've been watching those just in case any of you have some comments or questions about some of the things we've talked about. We've put the issue of the omnibus spending bill on the table, and again, love to get your comments about whether or not the president should veto this and then possibly have a government shutdown or just go ahead. Another one is on the pregnancy centers and speech. And then as we start the next hour, we have so many other issues to talk about. Certainly the omnibus spending bill is one that we'll continue talking about. We also want to get into the appointment, it looks like, of John Bolton in a very strategic place, and we'll talk about some of that as well. I just mentioned that in the third hour today, we even have the Irwin brothers with us. You might say, well, who are they? Well, they produced a film that did extremely well this last weekend, won $17 million worth, and that is, of course, I Can Only Imagine. You might remember some of their earlier films, October Baby, Mom's Night Out, Woodlawn, which did very well. I was talking yesterday with the executive producer, because he happened to be at Dallas Baptist University where I was, and Raymond was saying that they're already like at about $22 million. The film only cost $7 million. So basically, last Friday night, they paid for the film.
Wow, that's incredible. You know, it's fun to see and just wonderful to see Christian movies with a message of Christ doing well. Because, you know, there was a time when we kind of settled for lower production values and the quality suffered, and because we're Christians, we're like, well, okay, that's the best we can do. But Christians can do great things, and it's good to see these movies doing well, and people, hopefully people who don't know the Lord watching them and seeing them, and just messages spreading and things like that. I mean, when you think about all the things we talk about on Point of View and the challenges that the nation faces, and especially the idea that our country doesn't have a Christian consensus or a biblical consensus anymore on all kinds of things. So to see that it's good. It's good to see that influence is there and Christ is still speaking.
Of course, you got the Kendrick brothers, and they're out of Georgia, and so they've given you everything from Fireproof to, of course, War Room. War Room, one of the more successful ones. Pure Flix, of course, has produced 2 and now has a third one coming out on God Is Not Dead. Of course, this weekend you also have the one, Paul the Apostle, and some of those. So those are all really successful films, and I just wish them well. So we'll have Irwin brothers with us. Louis Gohmert will be with us a little bit later. He's convinced that a few of these people that filed this erroneous FISA warrant should go in front of a judge and maybe go to jail. So we'll have some comments from him as well. And we will spend a little bit of time talking about the omnibus spending bill the next hour, but we'll be talking about it as a foregone conclusion because the president just signed the bill. So there is where we find ourselves in that regard. So live radio, that's what we're finding out. But Kelly, just before we run out of time in this hour, we talked about some of these compelled speech cases. You, of course, have one out of Oregon that parallels the one out of Colorado with Jack Phillips. Talk about those for just a minute, because just as we went to the break, I don't know of a time when we've had so many of these compelled speech cases. And I made the comment that if they all go the wrong way, we're in a bad way. If they all go the right way, you've got some incredible precedents there at First Liberty, don't you?
I think so. And I feel pretty good about them overall. We'll have to wait and see. We'll probably find out about all 3 of these, most likely at the very end of June, when the justices typically on the last days, issue their most controversial opinions, and then by the time they're out in the press, they're on planes on their way to Europe to do their teaching forays in the summer. So that's probably there's time to pray between now and the end of June, and then we'll see what happens. But yeah, the case just argued, of course, which is about whether the state of California that ordered essentially pregnancy care centers to number one, refer to abortions, and number two, to say if they're not a licensed facility, because they never meant to be, they have to say they're unlicensed and put it in 13 different languages and all this stuff. That's the first case, the compelled speech case. The second, the Jack Phillips case, was the masterpiece case. It was a case where you had two males that were wanting to be married coming in and saying, not just, we want a wedding cake, but we want you to custom make our wedding cake. And Jack Phillips was willing to sell them anything, but as a Christian, he couldn't make a gay wedding cake. And the lawsuit was about whether he had the religious freedom ability to do that, or whether the government could force him, which is what happened in Colorado, saying that you must do this, or, we will, put you out of business. And so he lost over half of his business because he couldn't do wedding cakes anymore for anybody as a result. Our case is very similar to that, which I think most people have heard about, out of Oregon. Aaron and Melissa Klein, who, wonderful Christian couple, had a lesbian couple come in and want to buy baked goods. They loved serving them, knew who they were and everything, had no problem with that. But then they said, we want you to do our wedding cake. And they said, we can't do a custom cake because of our faith. And our cakes are very specific and our beliefs about marriage and what God says about marriage. But we're happy to refer you. They did that. Next thing they knew, the state of Oregon was coming after them. They've now been fined $135,000. Their shop has been bankrupted. The original order by the judge was that they not speak publicly their beliefs about marriage. So that's a very similar case. That was, in fact, just filed in the Oregon Supreme Court at the beginning of this month. And then the third case you mentioned at the Supreme Court is the case about compulsory dues in a union that can be used for political purposes. And again, that is essentially saying we are going to, if you want to work, we will take your money and we will use it to express things that you disagree with. So we're essentially forcing you to pay for messages that you find repugnant, that you disagree with. Again, it's forced speech. And all of these are sort of the ultimate intolerance, right? I mean, because in all of these cases, there's a way to let everybody sort of live and let live, right? I mean, let's take the union situation. If you want to express something, fine, but use money from people who agree with that. There's no reason to force somebody to say, we'll use your money for something different, but not for, political speech. Let's say if you're Jack Phillips, there's plenty of bake shops, okay? There's plenty of places to get a cake. Yeah. There's no reason to force Jack Phillips or Aaron and Melissa Klein, to violate their faith in that way. I mean, there's just no reason. And again, in California, if California really wants this message about, hey, we want to give an 800 number out about where you can get free abortions, then California has plenty of ability to get the message out. There's no reason that they need to force private citizens to express things that they disagree with. So in all of these cases, as all pretty much compelled speech, there's no reason for it. It's the ultimate intolerance, and it really violates everything that is about what this country is about free speech, about people having the freedom to express things different from the government. That's what the marketplace of ideas is about. And if we lose this, then we really lose the very heart of our country.
Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some more of those issues. And again, we've already talked a little bit about the omnibus spending bill, and so now we'll talk about the fact that the president has signed it, but what that might mean and how that is going to affect some of the debate. And we'll just return maybe a little bit to the pregnancy center, since some of the other listeners have not had a chance to hear that. John Bolton is going to be serving in the administration along with a number of others, Larry Kudlow and others. This will be interesting because a couple of strong personalities with the president. We'll see how that plays itself out. And, of course, we have had some conversation this week about the tariffs and the response from China and a lot of other things. So we've got a lot to cover. If you find yourself saying, I'd like to learn a little bit more about this, we've posted some of the articles, and we will post some of the commentaries that we are talking about all on the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to support this ministry. So please take the time to go to pointofview.net, click on that button that says donate, and we'll be back right after this.
From PureFlix comes God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Even in life's darkest valleys, a small flame can light the way toward healing and hope.
We are called to be a light in the darkness.
Starring David A.R. White and John Corbett. God's Not Dead, a light in darkness. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. In theaters March 30th. More information is available at godsnotdead.com.
Christians are called to have answers. Answers for those who doubt our faith and answers for those going through difficult times. Thanks to our Truth Team members, Point of View provides those answers. You can play a vital role in bringing truth to the pressing issues of our day and truth when life doesn't seem fair. Help shine a light in darkness by giving today. Call 800-347-5151 or visit pointofview.net/team. Do not miss or minimize how much of a difference you can make. Take just a couple of minutes and join the Truth Team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.